Welcome back. Today we're going to actually cover biomolecule overview. We're going to talk about all the 4 different types of biomolecules we mentioned in the last video. Firstly, we're going to start with carbohydrates. They're biochemicals made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Except the really cool thing is they follow a very close ratio. There are 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen per carbon. So what you're looking at is C6H12O6 is actually the example of glucose. You must memorize that chemical equation right there. Carbohydrates are used for quick energy sources. And last time I left you off thinking about some examples. So please write down some examples of how carbs affect your daily diet, and then when you unpause, we're going to cover a couple more. So some examples of sugars or glucose can be found in candy. You got some candy corn up at the top right. Plant starches are found in pasta, bread, and vegetables. If you think about it, we get flour from wheat, which is grown in fields. It's actually plants, and then we grind them down, and we're actually taking the carbs from there and using them. Plant cell walls are actually made of cellulose, which is the same idea of a carbohydrate. It's just a bunch of those tiny sugars put together in a different arrangement. Going forward, simplest unit of a carbohydrate is a saccharide or a sugar molecule. Simplest sugar, which is a monosaccharide, just stands for one sugar. Glucose and fructose, which is fructose is actually fruit sugar, are both monosaccharides. Like I said, glucose is going to be one of the most important carbohydrates you need for the living environment regions. It's C6H12O6. Now, when you have 2 saccharides put together, you call that a disaccharide. 3 saccharides, you have a trisaccharide. Anything more than 3, you can consider a polysaccharide. Cellulose for cell walls is a glucose polymer. Polymer is another word you could use for a really large molecule. Switching gears into lipids. Lipids are also made from carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but they actually are mainly composed of carbon and hydrogen with very little oxygen. So they don't follow that nice ratio that a carbohydrate follows. Commonly, we call lipids fats, and they're very easy to just identify as fats. They contain larger amounts of energy per gram. And if you think about it, any food that you don't digest, your body turns to fat because they can store it in larger molecules. Granted, it doesn't look good on our bodies, but hey, you need it when you need it. Think of some lipids that you may have interacted with a couple times, and hopefully you came up with solid fats such as butter, meat fat, like if you ever had a steak and you see the trimmings of fat on the side, or waxes. We use waxes for candles. You have liquid fats such as vegetable oil, olive oil, canola oil, and then you also have steroids as a different type of lipid. And components of your cell membrane are actually made of lipids, or they need lipids, specifically cholesterol, and technically the real name of a cell membrane is called the phospholipid bilayer. Now, just to get your minds rolling about lipids and how much they love water, I'm being sarcastic there, what happens when you put water and vegetable oil together? If you look at the image, you're going to see that they don't mix, and there's actually a very big reason why. Lipids are insoluble in water, which means they cannot dissolve in water. They're nonpolar and they're not attracted to water molecules that are polar. So like I was saying before in the first lecture, there are 2 main components of a lipid. A carbon backbone, which is the glycerol found in blue, and then you have 3 fatty acid chains, which are represented by the red chemicals. You've probably heard of saturated and unsaturated fats, which is actually commonly bad for you. Which one's known as bad for you? Hopefully you actually said saturated fats because they're all single bonds. Saturated fats are solid at room temperature because all the bonds are single bonds and there's no room for bonding with more hydrogen atoms, versus an unsaturated fat has at least 1 double bond. And the double bond is much weaker than a single bond. So it's easier to actually break those down inside your body. And this is a visual representation of lipids. If you look at the top image, it has 1 double bond directly in the center, represented by that double line that looks like an equal sign. And then if you look at the bottom, you have 2 double bonds. Those points are actually going to be much easier to break because they're much weaker. Now, lipid function, We use them to store energy in cells. We use them to insulate. If you think about blubber, blubber in seals, blubber in whales, they're used for insulation. They keep all that energy inside. They're thick. Actually, when they used to go whale hunting in like Alaska or Antarctica, they would use the whale's fat as candle oil. It's pretty cool. Parts of the cell membrane, protective covering, such as the waxy surfaces on plant cells or certain plant cells. If you ever touch a pine needles are kind of waxy on the outside. That's why they can actually survive the winter because they have that nice insulation. Moving on to the next biomolecule is nucleic acids. It's a biomolecule that stores hereditary information as a code. Basic units are nucleotides. They actually are composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Now we have a new element. So there are three main components. You have a nitrogenous base, which is one of the four: adenine, guanine, thymine, cytosine, a sugar, and a phosphate group. Okay, so if you're looking at the image to the right, A, which is the kind of beige circle on the left-hand side, that's your phosphate group. Then you have the blue, which is your sugar molecule. And then you have C, which is actually your nitrogenous base. And that will switch on and off based on if it's adenine, guanine, thymine, or cytosine. We won't worry about any of that until we get to genetics later on. But there are two different types of nucleic acids. You have DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid, codes for all proteins used by a cell. And then you have RNA, which is ribonucleic acid, which is used specifically for protein synthesis or making proteins. Quiz time. Where do you make proteins inside a cell? Hopefully you said ribosomes. Very good job. Now, proteins. They're a polymer or molecule made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sometimes sulfur. They can also be used for energy, but that would be like your last resort. Your body would prioritize carbohydrates, lipids, and then proteins would be the end all be all. If you were starving in the desert somewhere, that's what they would go to. Their basic unit are amino acids. There are 20 common amino acids placed in different combinations to make distinct proteins. So there are only 20 amino acids out there. When you eat meat, your body breaks whatever meat you eat down into these amino acids. And based how these 20 amino acids are arranged and how they're folded is actually how you get your new protein that your body needs. So depending on which amino acids are in the protein and how the protein twists and folds, depends on what kind of protein you have. And it's also held together by hydrogen bonds. You can also call this a polypeptide chain. The basic structure of an amino acid you can find at the top right. Very confusing, but don't worry about that. That's higher levels of chemistry and biology. And the amino acids are linked by peptide bonds. So we could call it a polypeptide chain as another way of saying enzyme or protein for the easy generic name. What sources of protein can you think of? Hopefully you're thinking of a nice juicy steak or certain plants like beans. I know have a lot of protein for you. Now proteins are found in muscle tissue, foods such as eggs and tofu, enzymes used to transport of oxygen for hemoglobin. I don't know if you guys know what hemoglobin is, but it's a component inside your blood that helps you it bonds to the oxygen molecules, so that way they can take a nice ride through your body, providing immunity and regulating other proteins. Now, cell organelles need proteins to actually function properly, and a component of hair. I'm sure all you ladies that have gotten a keratin hair treatment should know what a protein is, and we can use them to our advantage. Lastly, we have protein function. They building up parts of an organism such as your muscles. So if you ever work out or you do some physical activity and you feel that tear, proteins are going to be what help repair that tear inside your muscle. We use proteins to transport oxygen, like I was saying before, hemoglobin, and we use proteins to help chemical reactions work, and those are in the form of enzymes, which we're going to get to in another lecture. Hope this was informative.